while history remembers her as Die Einzige, the only one, the golden favorite of the legendary Empress Sisi, and the anointed savior of the Hungarian alliance. She was, in reality, a desperate biological maneuver, a human peace treaty constructed of flesh and blood. Her name was Archduchess Marie Valerie. How did a child born to hold an empire together end up despising the very nation she was created to seduce, spending her entire existence trying to apologize for the calculated tragedy of her own birth? The collapse felt inevitable. By 1867, the Austrian Empire was bleeding out, crushed between the external humiliation of Prussian defeat and the internal fire of a Hungary determined to shatter the monarchy entirely. Emperor Franz Joseph, a man of rigid duty and military discipline, found himself cornered, forced to negotiate a dual monarchy that would create the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But political treaties are cold, ink-stained documents. They do not capture the hearts of a people. To truly seal this fragile alliance, the emperor needed more than a signature. He needed a symbol. And the architect of this symbol was not a diplomat or a general, but his wife, Empress Elizabeth. Cece, who had long fled the suffocating etiquette of the Viennese court, had found a spiritual home in Hungary. She adored the wild landscapes, the fiery temperament of the Magyar aristocracy, and, most scandalously, the company of the dashing Hungarian statesman Count Gyula Andrássy. It was Cece who brokered the peace, using her immense influence to convince her stubborn husband to accept the. She adored the wild landscapes, the fiery temperament of the Magyar aristocracy, and, most scandalously, the company of the dashing Hungarian statesman Count Gyula Andrássy. It was Cece who brokered the peace, using her immense influence to convince her stubborn husband to accept the compromise of 1867. But Cece, a woman of transactional emotions, demanded a price for her political intervention. She would give the emperor his treaty, and she would return to his bed to conceive one last child, but only on her own terms. This was the grand design behind the conception of Marie Valerie. Unlike her older siblings, Gisela and Crown Prince Rudolph, who had been snatched from Cece's arms by their grandmother and raised as strictly Austrian princes of the court, this new child was to be Cece's personal property. The Empress delivered an ultimatum to Franz Joseph. She would bear him another heir, but the child must be born on Hungarian soil. This baby was to be a Hungarian child, a living gift to the nation she loved, intended to be the future king or queen of Hungary, a figurehead who would bind the Magyars to the Habsburg crown forever. It is difficult to overstate the immense pressure placed upon this unborn life. Before a heart had even formed or a breath had even been taken, Marie Valerie was already weighted with the heavy chains of geopolitical expectation. She was a calculated political gesture, conceived to cement the coronation of Franz Joseph and Elizabeth as King and Queen of Hungary in June 1867. The atmosphere leading up to her birth in April 1868 was thick with tension and malice. Cece had retreated to the royal palace in Buda, abandoning Vienna and isolating herself from the Austrian aristocracy, who viewed her pro-Hungarian sentiments with deep suspicion and jealousy. The Viennese court was rife with venomous whispers. They despised the fact that their empress had effectively kidnapped the potential heir to raise among foreigners. But the whispers turned darker, festering into a rumor that would haunt Marie Valerie for the rest of her life. The gossips of the Hofburg, fueled by malice and the empress's known intimacy with the Hungarian statesman, began to suggest that the child Cece carried was not the emperor's at all. They whispered that this was the bastard of Andrássy, a product of the empress's emotional and perhaps physical betrayal. Although historians and biology would later prove these rumors unequivocally false. Marie Valerie would grow up to possess the signature Habsburg lip and the undeniable eyes of Franz Joseph. The poison had already been poured. This slanderous campaign meant that Marie Valerie entered the world not amidst universal celebration, but into a cloud of illegitimacy and courtly hatred. On April 22, 1868, the cannons roared over Buda. Empress Elizabeth, after a difficult labor, gave birth to a daughter. The reaction was a complicated mixture of relief and profound disappointment. Cece and the Hungarian nationalists had been praying fervently for a boy, a Stephen, named after the patron saint and first king of Hungary. A male heir born on Hungarian soil could have theoretically been raised to be the king of Hungary, creating a separate line of succession that might have satisfied the wildest dreams of Magyar independence. When the news broke that the child was a girl, the political utility of the infant diminished instantly. She could not be a king. She could not be a revolutionary messiah. She was just a girl. Yet for Cece, the gender of the child became a secret blessing. A son would have belonged to the state, to the army, to the empire. A son would have been taken away to be drilled in warfare and protocol. But a daughter could be kept. A daughter could be possessed. Thus began the unique and suffocating childhood of Archduchess Marie Valerie. She was christened Marie Valerie Mathilde Amélie, a name that carried no heavy Habsburg ancestry, signaling a break from tradition. From her very first breath, she was sequestered in the rural idyll of Gödöllő Palais, the Empress's favorite Hungarian retreat. Cece, who had been a distant, terrified ghost to her older children, unleashed a torrent of maternal affection upon Valerie that bordered on the obsessive. She called the infant Die Einzige, the only one. This moniker was a cruel knife to the hearts of Gisela and Rudolph, who remained in Vienna observing from a distance as their mother poured all the love she had denied them into this new stranger. Valerie was not just a child to Cece. She was a vindication, a companion, and a mirror. The Empress micromanaged every second of Valerie's existence, supervising her baths, her meals, and her movements with a neurotic intensity that shocked the few courtiers allowed into their inner sanctum. However, the great irony of Marie Valerie's early life, and indeed the central conflict of her entire psychological development, was the failure of Cece's Hungarian experiment. The Empress was determined to mold Valerie into a perfect Hungarian patriot. The child was surrounded by Hungarian nurses dressed in Hungarian folk costumes and forbidden to speak German in her mother's presence. Cece spoke to her only in Magyar, desperate to forge a linguistic and cultural bond that would exclude the hated court of Vienna. But the human soul is not clay to be molded by political will. As Valerie grew from an infant into a quiet, observant toddler, a profound resistance began to take root in her character. She did not feel Hungarian. In fact, she began to develop a visceral, instinctive aversion to everything her mother tried to force upon her. This rejection was fueled by the shadow of the rumors regarding her paternity. Even as a young child, Valerie was perceptive. She sensed the hostility of the Austrian relatives and the hushed tones of the servants. She understood on some primal level that her connection to Hungary was the source of her shame. To be Hungarian was to be the bastard of Andrassy. To be Hungarian was to be the reason her father looked so sad and weary. Consequently, Marie Valerie began to rebel in the only way a powerless child could. She quietly, stubbornly aligned herself with her father. She worshipped Emperor Franz Joseph. Whenever the emperor visited Gödöllő, bringing with him the stiff German militarism of Vienna, Valerie lit up. She insisted on speaking German with him, much to Cece's frustration. She loved the structure, the piety, and the simplicity of her father's world, a stark contrast to the emotional volatility and bohemian chaos of her mother's court. By the time she was 5 years old, the dynamic was set in stone. Marie Valerie was a child trapped between two warring empires embodied by her parents. On one side was Cece, the suffocating, beautiful, erratic mother who dragged her across Europe on endless, restless travels, treating her as an emotional crutch. On the other was Franz Joseph, the distant but beloved father representing duty, order, and legitimacy. Valerie spent her childhood in a golden cage, traveling from Moran to the Isle of Wight, from crumbling Greek ruins to stormy Atlantic coasts, rarely staying in one place long enough to make friends. She had no playmates her own age. Her only companion was her mother's overwhelming grief and melancholy. Cece, often suffering from depressive episodes, would pour her heart out to the young girl, treating Valerie as a confidant rather than a daughter. Valerie learned to navigate her mother's moods, becoming a quiet, serious, and deeply religious child, far older than her years. She absorbed the sorrow of the Empress, carrying the weight of Cece's unhappiness on her small shoulders, all while yearning for the stability of Vienna, the very place her mother fled. As she entered adolescence, the rift between her reality and her mother's fantasy widened. Cece wanted a wild, free-spirited daughter who despised court protocol. Instead, she got Valerie, modest, practical, devoutly Catholic, and deeply conservative. Valerie was, in essence, her father's daughter in spirit, trapped in her mother's world. This caused the young Archduchess immense guilt. She loved her mother fiercely. It was impossible not to be captivated by Cece's charisma and neediness, but she felt constantly inadequate because she could not be the Hungarian revolutionary Cece desired. In her secret diaries, which she began writing at a young age, Valerie confessed her deepest sin. She loved the German language. She loved Austria, and she felt like a fraud whenever she was forced to perform the role of the Hungarian princess. The tension came to a head whenever the family reunited in Vienna. For Valerie, the Hofburg Palace was not a prison, as it was for Cece, but a place of curiosity and anxiety. It was here that she had to face her siblings, Rudolf and Gisela. The meetings were excruciating. Rudolf, the brilliant, liberal, and unstable crown prince, looked upon Valerie with a mixture of cynicism and pity. He saw her as the spoiled brat who had stolen the mother's love he so desperately craved. Gisela, who had married young just to escape the family dynamic, was equally distant. They called her the other one, the Hungarian, or simply mother's pet. Valerie, sensitive and desperate for family unity, felt this rejection keenly. She tried to bridge the gap, but the walls built by Cece's favoritism were too high to scale. She was isolated within her own dynasty, a solitary island in the Habsburg archipelago. Yet it was this very isolation that sharpened her observations, because she was the only one allowed in the room when Cece cried, the only one who saw the emperor's vulnerability when he begged his wife to come home. Valerie became the keeper of secrets. She began to see the cracks in the monarchy long before the politicians did. She saw the madness encroaching on her cousin, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. She saw the dangerous depression clouding her brother Rudolph's eyes. She saw the exhaustion in her father's stooped shoulders. By the late 1880s, as Valerie approached her 18th birthday, she was no longer just a child pawn. She was becoming the emotional anchor of the family, the only person who could translate the emperor's duty to the empress, and the empress's pain to the emperor. If childhood was a confusing tug-of-war between two nations, adolescence for Archduchess Marie Valerie was a descent into a glittering, mobile purgatory. By the early 1880s, the fragile peace that held Empress Elizabeth together began to fracture. As Valerie blossomed into a young woman, she found herself conscripted into a role far more exhausting than that of a princess. She became the sole companion to a wandering, melancholic spirit. The Empress, increasingly terrified of aging and disgusted by the stifling gossip of Vienna, embarked on a ceaseless odyssey across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And where the Empress went, the only one had to follow. Imagine for a moment the psychological landscape of a teenage girl in this environment. While other European princesses were attending balls, learning the intricate dances of courtship, and integrating into high society, Marie Valerie was trapped on the imperial yacht Miramar, battered by storms off the coast of Greece, or sequestered in isolated villas on the island of Corfu. She was the captive audience to her mother's deepening obsession with the poet Heinrich Heine. Cece, believing herself to be a spiritual medium for the deceased poet, would spend hours reciting his bleak, cynical verses, casting herself as Titania, the fairy queen, and her husband as the distant Oberon. Valerie was forced to inhabit this fantasy world, nodding politely as her mother spoke of death, spirits, and the futility of life. In her diaries, the young Archduchess revealed the crushing weight of this intimacy. She described feeling suffocated by the relentless intensity of her mother's love, a love that demanded total emotional submission. Cece did not just want a daughter. She wanted a mirror that reflected only her own sorrow. Valerie, naturally grounded and pious, found this performative grief exhausting. She longed for the mundane, for the solid earth of Austria, and for the simple, unpoetic routines of a normal life. It was against this backdrop of high drama and emotional claustrophobia that Marie Valerie staged her quiet rebellion. It was not a rebellion of shouting or scandal. That was her brother Rudolph's domain. But a rebellion of the heart. She decided with a stubbornness inherited from her father that she would be normal. She began to distance herself from her mother's morbid fascinations, immersing herself instead in charity work and religion. She sought solace in the structure of the Catholic Church, finding in the rituals of the Mass a stability that her mother's erratic spirituality could never provide. And then, at a ball in 1886, the rebellion found a face. His name was Archduke Franz Salvator. He was a member of the Tuscan branch of the Habsburg family, a minor line, respectable but hardly the dynastic powerhouse a daughter of the emperor was expected to marry. He was not a king in waiting. He was not a grand intellectual like Crown Prince Rudolph. In fact, many at court considered him rather simple, a man of average intelligence, whose interests lay in hunting, riding, and the easy pleasures of country life. But to Marie Valerie, he was a revelation. He was handsome, yes, with a dashing military mustache and a bright, open face, but more importantly, he was light. He did not speak of Heine or death or the burden of the crown. He laughed, he made jokes. He embodied the healthy, uncomplicated masculinity that Valerie had been starved of in her mother's gloom-laden household. The courtship was a slow, tentative dance conducted under the watchful eyes of a court that viewed Franz Salvator as unworthy. The dynasties of Europe were lining up for the hand of the emperor's favorite daughter. The kings of Portugal and Saxony, the dukes of Braganza, these were the matches expected of her. To choose a minor archduke was seen as a waste of supreme political capital. But here, the grand design of Marie Valerie's birth twisted in her favor. Because she was the only one, the child of Cece's heart, Cece was determined that Valerie would not suffer the same marital hell she had endured. In a move that shocked the rigid Victorian sensibilities of the era, the Empress threw her immense support behind her daughter's choice. "I will not let her be sold," Cece declared, her voice cutting through the objections of the court. She famously told Valerie that she could marry even a chimney sweep, provided it was a man she truly loved. This was a revolutionary stance, a direct repudiation of the Habsburg tradition of strategic alliances. For Valerie, her mother's support was a double-edged sword. It secured her happiness, yes, but it further alienated her from her siblings. Gisela had been married off at 16 to a Bavarian prince in a loveless political arrangement. Rudolf had been forced into a disastrous union with Princess Stephanie of Belgium, a woman he loathed. Seeing Valerie allowed to choose a husband for love, purely for love, deepened the chasm of resentment within the family. Rudolf, in particular, watched his little sister's blooming romance with a mixture of cynicism and heartbreak. He wrote letters that dripped with bitterness, noting how the Hungarian Child was permitted a humanity that the heir to the throne was denied. But as 1888 bled into 1889, the joy of Valerie's secret engagement was overshadowed by a darkness gathering over Vienna. The atmosphere in the Hofburg Palace grew toxic. Crown Prince Rudolf was disintegrating. Syphilis, morphine addiction, and political frustration were eating him alive. He had become a ghost in his own palace, his eyes hollow, his temper erratic. Valerie, with her keen observational skills, saw the decay that her parents refused to acknowledge. The emperor was too busy with state papers to see his son's desperation. The empress was too busy running away to notice her son slide into madness. Only Valerie, the quiet watcher, saw the tremors. She noted in her diary the strange manic energy of her brother, the way he looked at them as if he were already saying goodbye. The catastrophe arrived in the dead of winter, January 1889. The world was cold and gray, and the Habsburg monarchy stood at the precipice of a cliff it did not know was there. Rudolf had retreated to his hunting lodge at Mayerling, a secluded estate in the Vienna woods, ostensibly for a shooting party. On the morning of January 30th, 1889, a telegram arrived at the Hofburg. The news was so incomprehensible, so shattering, that the first instinct of the court was to lie. The initial reports claimed that the crown prince had suffered a heart attack. Then the story shifted. He had been poisoned by his mistress, the young Baroness Marie Valerie. But slowly the horrific truth began to bleed through the layers of censorship. Rudolf was dead. Marie Valerie was dead. And the gun that killed them both belonged to the crown prince. The impact of the Mayerling incident on Marie Valerie was instantaneous and devastating. She was 20 years old, standing in the hallway of the palace when the screams began. She was the one who had to catch her mother as the empress collapsed, not from grief, but from a terrifying feral panic. Cece did not weep like a normal mother. She howled. She believed that the curse of the Wittelsbachs, the madness that had claimed her cousin Ludwig, had finally come for her son. For Valerie, the trauma was twofold. First, there was the loss of her brother, the brilliant, damaged man she had never truly known but deeply pitied. But second, and perhaps more scarring, was the religious horror. Valerie was a devout Orthodox Catholic. In her worldview, suicide was a mortal sin, an act that condemned the soul to eternal damnation. The realization that her brother had not only killed himself, but had also murdered a teenage girl in a pact of illicit love shook the very foundations of her faith. She was terrified for his soul. While the emperor worried about the succession and the empress worried about the curse, Valerie worried about hell. In the days that followed, the Hofburg became a mausoleum. The windows were draped in black crepe. The mirrors were covered. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of weeping. And in this vacuum of leadership, Marie Valerie was forced to grow up overnight. The child was gone. The caretaker was born. Emperor Franz Joseph, the Iron Man of Europe, was broken. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at documents, an old man crushed by the shame of his son's crime. Cece, unable to cope with the reality of the situation, retreated into a delirium of grief, refusing to eat, refusing to speak, pacing her rooms like a caged animal. It fell to Valerie to be the bridge. She was the only one who could enter her father's study without being dismissed. She sat with him for hours, holding his hand in silence, offering the only comfort he would accept, her presence. She became his angel, the only remnant of purity in a blood-stained house. Simultaneously, she had to manage her mother. Cece's grief was volatile and selfish. She clung to Valerie, declaring that now truly Valerie was all she had left. "We two against the world," Cece whispered, trying to pull Valerie back into her isolation. But this time, Valerie resisted. She saw that the family was drowning, and she knew that if she allowed herself to be pulled into her mother's whirlpool of despair, she would drown too. The funeral of Crown Prince Rudolph was a grotesque spectacle of pomp and misery. Valerie watched from behind a heavy black veil as her brother's coffin was lowered into the Capuchin crypt. She saw the faces of the crowd, confused, angry, mourning a future that would never happen. She realized then that the grand design of her birth was a mockery. She had been born to save the empire with a gesture of life, but the empire was dying of death. The Hungarians, whom she was supposed to charm, were now restless, sensing the weakness of the dynasty. The Austrians were in shock. The monarchy had lost its heir, and the only backup was the emperor's unlikable brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, and his son, Franz Ferdinand, men whom Valerie neither liked nor trusted. In the aftermath of Mayerling, a profound change settled over Marie Valerie. The dreaminess of youth evaporated. She looked at her fiancé, Franz Salvator, with a new urgency. He was no longer just a romantic preference. He was her escape hatch. She realized that if she remained in the Habsburg, she would be consumed by her parents' grief. She would become nothing more than a nursemaid to a dying dynasty, a perpetual mourner at the altar of her brother's memory. She had to get out. She had to live. But the road to freedom was paved with guilt. How could she leave her parents now? How could she plan a wedding when her brother was barely cold in his grave? The conflict tore her apart. Her diaries from this period are heart-wrenching, filled with prayers for forgiveness, for wanting to be happy when everyone else was in agony. She wrote of feeling like a traitor for dreaming of her wedding dress, while her mother wore only widow's weeds. Yet the instinct for survival was strong. Valerie understood a truth that her parents could not face. The Habsburgs were cursed not by fate, but by their own rigidity, their own inability to love simply and humanely. She wanted a simple, humane love. She wanted Franz Salvator. By the summer of 1890, the Habsburg Empire was a wounded animal, limping forward under the weight of its own history. The tragedy of Mayerling had left a permanent scar on the psyche of Vienna, but amidst the mourning veils and the hushed whispers, a singular defiant light was struggling to burn. Archduchess Marie Valerie, now 22 years old, was preparing to do the unthinkable. She was preparing to be happy. However, in the House of Habsburg, happiness was never free. It was a commodity to be purchased, and the price was steep. Before Marie Valerie could walk down the aisle to marry her beloved Archduke Franz Salvator, she had to endure a ritual of legal humiliation known as the renunciation. On July 16, 1890, at the Hermes Villa, the Palace of Dreams in the Vienna woods, that her father had built to bribe her mother into staying in Austria, Marie Valerie stood before a gathering of ministers, lawyers, and family members. The atmosphere was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of her feelings. On the table lay a document of immense constitutional weight. It was a formal declaration in which she, the favorite daughter of the emperor, voluntarily renounced all rights to the Austrian throne for herself and her future descendants. To the modern observer, this might seem a mere formality, but to the legitimist eyes of the 19th century, it was a profound act of self-abnegation. By signing that paper, Marie Valerie was stripping herself of her birthright. She was stating, in ink and blood, that her love for a minor Tuscan archduke was worth more than the crown of St. Stephen or the imperial scepter. As she picked up the pen, her hand did not tremble. Witnesses described her demeanor as calm, almost serene. She was not losing a kingdom. She was buying her freedom. She was purchasing the right to be a wife and a mother rather than a political chess piece. When the signature was dry, she looked at her father, Emperor Franz Joseph. His eyes were filled with a mixture of pride and devastating sadness. He was allowing his angel to fly away, severing the last tether that bound her to the crushing responsibilities of the state. 2 weeks later, on July 31st, 1890, the wedding took place in the imperial town of Bad Ischl. It should have been the fairy tale of the decade, but the ghost of Mayerling was an uninvited guest who sat in the front pew. The ceremony was not a celebration of dynastic might, but a subdued, almost somber family affair. The contrast between the bride and her mother was grotesque. Marie Valerie stood at the altar, radiant with hope, embodying the future. Beside her stood Empress Elizabeth, draped entirely in black, her face hidden behind a dense mourning veil, looking like a Greek tragedy manifested in flesh. Cece sobbed audibly throughout the service. To the guests, it was unclear whether she was crying tears of joy for her daughter's escape or tears of self-pity for her own abandonment. Despite the funereal atmosphere imposed by her mother, Marie Valerie's victory was absolute. She had done it. She had married Franz Salvator. In her diary that night, the relief was palpable. She wrote of the golden freedom that now awaited her. She believed, with the naive certainty of a woman in love, that she had solved the riddle of her life. She had escaped the golden cage. The early years of her marriage were a deliberate, almost aggressive rejection of everything her childhood had been. If Cece's court was a place of wandering, poetry, and neurotic starvation, Valerie's home was to be a fortress of stability, food, and fertility. The couple initially settled in Wels, and later, in 1897, they purchased the magnificent Schloss Wallsee, a castle overlooking the Danube. Schloss Wallsee became the stage for Valerie's anti-court. Here, there were no rigid protocols, no whispering courtiers, and no agonizing discussions about the metaphysics of death. Instead, there was noise, the glorious, chaotic noise of life. Marie Valerie threw herself into motherhood with a ferocity that stunned her relatives. She did not stop at an heir and a spare. She gave birth to 10 children in roughly 15 years. This explosive fertility was a statement. It was a physical manifestation of her rejection of Cece's vanity. Cece had starved herself to maintain a 19-inch waist, terrified that pregnancy would ruin her legendary beauty. Valerie, by contrast, allowed her body to swell and change, finding a holy purpose in the creation of life. She was the earth mother to Cece's fairy queen. At Wallsee, Valerie was the absolute monarch of her domestic sphere. She was a hands-on mother, breastfeeding her children, teaching them catechism, and instilling in them the values of charity and humility. But even in this domestic idol, the fatal flaw of her life began to germinate. The flaw was her blindness to the true nature of the men she adored. Just as she idolized her father, ignoring his rigidity, She idolized Franz Salvator, ignoring his vacuity. In the beginning, Franz Salvator played the role of the devoted husband well. He was charming, affluent, and enjoyed the prestige of being the emperor's son-in-law. But as the years wore on, and Valerie became consumed by her cycle of pregnancies and child-rearing, the Archduke grew bored. He was a man of superficial appetites. He lacked Valerie's intellectual depth and her profound, almost mystic piety. While she was organizing hospitals for the poor and writing deeply introspective diary entries, he was looking for amusement. He began to spend more time in Vienna, away from the screaming children and the pious atmosphere of Wallsee. The cracks in the marriage were hairline fractures at first, a late night here, a rumor there, but they were the early warning signs of the humiliation to come. However, before the marital storm could break, the sky turned black once again. The date was September 10th, 1898. Empress Elizabeth was 60 years old. She was staying in Geneva, Switzerland, traveling under a pseudonym, continuing her restless flight from reality. She was walking along the promenade toward a steamer boat when a young Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini rushed at her. He was armed with a sharpened industrial file. He stabbed her once in the chest. The puncture wound was so small and precise that Cece did not even realize she had been mortally wounded. She boarded the boat, collapsed, and died shortly after. The news reached Wallsee like a thunderclap. For Marie Valerie, the shock was cataclysmic. Her relationship with her mother had been the defining axis of her life, a complex web of love, guilt, resentment, and dependency. Even after her marriage, they had written constantly. Now the fairy queen was dead, murdered by a stranger who simply wanted to kill a royal, any royal. But with the death of the empress came a new and terrible burden, the inheritance. Marie Valerie was named the primary heir to Cece's personal estate. This included not just the palaces and the jewels, but something far more dangerous, Cece's mind. Valerie inherited her mother's private diaries, her poetry, and her letters, the Titania archive. As the dutiful daughter sat down to read these papers, intending to preserve her mother's memory, she was horrified. What she found in those pages was not the grief of a saint, but the rage of a radical. Cece's writings were filled with Republican sentiments. She mocked the monarchy. She expressed a hatred for the court, a disdain for the aristocracy, and even questioned the validity of the Habsburg reign. She wrote of her desire for death, her flirtations with suicide, and her blasphemous spiritual beliefs. For Valerie, the devout Catholic and loyal Habsburg, this was a spiritual crisis. She was faced with a brutal choice, the truth or the myth. If she published these papers, she would destroy her father. The emperor, already broken by the loss of his wife, would be humiliated by the revelation that Cece had despised everything he stood for. Marie Valerie made her choice. She chose the father. She chose the lie. In a quiet act of historical vandalism, she sanitized the archive. She locked away the most damaging documents. She became the gatekeeper of the Cece legend, protecting the world from the complex, dark reality of the woman who had raised her. Yet the trauma of 1898 served to deepen Valerie's isolation. She was now the only person left who truly understood the tragedy of her parents' marriage. Her father was now the old man of Schönbrunn, a lonely figure working 14 hours a day to keep the empire running. Valerie visited him often, bringing her children to brighten his gloomy halls. She became the first lady of the empire, in all but name, accompanying him to official functions, filling the void left by Cece. But as the new century dawned, the 1900s, the world was changing faster than the Habsburgs could comprehend. Nationalism was tearing the empire apart. Socialists were marching in the streets. And in the privacy of Wallsee, The charming facade of Franz Salvator was finally crumbling. The game-changing victory of her marriage was about to face its ultimate test. Valerie had built a sanctuary, but she had locked herself in with a man who did not share her values. As she entered her 30s, carrying her 8th, 9th, 10th child, she began to realize that she was not just fighting for her family's happiness. She was fighting a losing battle against the moral decay of her own husband. The chimney sweep whom Cece had blessed was about to drag the angel of Wallsee through the mud. By 1914, the golden cage of the Habsburg monarchy had rusted shut, trapping everyone inside. Europe was a powder keg waiting for a match. But inside the walls of Schloss Wallsee, a different kind of explosion was imminent. Archduchess Marie Valerie, now 46 years old, had spent 2 decades constructing a sanctuary of piety and domestic virtue. She had birthed 10 children, buried 1, and devoted her soul to the image of the perfect Catholic family. But the man she had built this sanctuary around, Archduke Franz Salvator, was about to tear it down with a callousness that would rival the cruelty of Greek tragedy. To the outside world, Franz Salvator was still the dashing, if slightly aging, imperial son-in-law. He wore his uniform well. He smiled for the cameras. He played the role of the devoted patriarch, but in reality he was a man consumed by boredom. The quiet, prayer-filled life at Wallsee, which Valerie found so nourishing, suffocated him. He was a creature of vanity and flesh, and as Valerie's health had declined after years of relentless childbearing, his wandering eye settled on a target that would maximize the humiliation of his wife. Enter Stephanie Richter. If Marie Valerie was the saint of the story, Stephanie Richter was the chaotic hurricane. Young, fiercely ambitious, and possessing a hypnotic, dangerous charm, Stephanie was a commoner determined to claw her way into the aristocracy. She was a master manipulator, a woman who viewed men not as partners, but as rungs on a ladder. She moved in the glittering, decadent circles of pre-war Vienna, where morals were loose and secrets were currency. It was there, amidst the waltzes and the champagne, that she ensnared Franz Salvator. The affair was not merely a dalliance, it was a wrecking ball. Franz Salvator, the man Valerie had fought the entire court to marry, fell hopelessly under the spell of this younger woman. For Valerie, the betrayal was absolute. She had renounced a throne for him. She had defied her brother and sister for him. She had given him a life of unimaginable privilege. And his repayment was to humiliate her with a woman who represented everything Valerie despised: ambition, vulgarity, and sin. The scandal reached its fever pitch in the early months of 1914. Stephanie Richter announced she was pregnant. In the rigid moral code of 1914, this was a nuclear catastrophe. Franz Salvator was the son-in-law of the Emperor of Austria. He could not be seen fathering a bastard with a social climber. The court panic was immediate. A cover-up was engineered with Machiavellian precision. Stephanie was hastily married off to Prince Friedrich Franz von Hohenlohe-Waldenburg Schillingsfürst, a frantic arrangement designed to give the unborn child a legitimate name. The child, Franz Joseph, was born in December 1914, but Marie Valerie knew. She knew everything. The pain she endured during this period is etched into the margins of her life. She did not scream. She did not file for divorce. She did not flee to the newspapers. Instead, she swallowed the poison. True to her character, the only one who had absorbed Cece's grief and Franz Joseph's duty, she chose to suffer in silence to protect the dignity of the dynasty. She looked at her husband across the dinner table, knowing he had just come from the bed of another woman, and she said nothing. This was the fatal flaw of her existence. a paralyzing loyalty to a family structure that consistently abused her. She viewed her suffering as a religious trial, a cross to be borne on the road to salvation. But the angel of Wallsee was bleeding from a wound that no bandage could cover. Ironically, just as her private world was imploding, the world outside was catching fire. On June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, Gavrilo Princip fired the 2 shots that killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie. Marie Valerie's reaction to the assassination was complex and shockingly honest. In her diary, she confessed that she felt no great personal grief for Franz Ferdinand. She had never liked him. She found him arrogant, difficult, and a threat to the peace her father had worked so hard to maintain. She even wrote that his death might be a grace for the monarchy, sparing Austria from his potentially disastrous reign. It was a rare moment of cold political calculation from the gentle Archduchess. However, she could not foresee that this death would not save the monarchy, but destroy it. As the dominoes of alliances fell and World War I erupted, Marie Valerie channeled her heartbreak into action. If she could not fix her marriage, she would try to fix the broken bodies of soldiers. She transformed Schloss Wallsee into a massive military hospital. This was not a vanity project where she posed for photos in a nurse's uniform. Marie Valerie worked. She scrubbed floors. She changed blood-soaked bandages. She sat by the beds of dying boys who cried out for their mothers, holding their hands until they went cold. The locals began to call her the Angel of Wallsee. They saw a saint walking among them. They did not see the woman who would retreat to her chapel at night, praying for the strength to forgive a husband who was arguably responsible for her emotional death. The war gave her a purpose that marriage no longer could. It allowed her to be the daughter of the people's emperor rather than the wife of an adulterer. But the war was merciless. It dragged on, bleeding the empire dry. Food shortages hit Vienna. The once glittering capital became a city of ghosts and starvation. And in the center of this gray web sat the spider, Emperor Franz Joseph. He was 86 years old. He had reigned for 68 years. He was the only reality most of his subjects had ever known. But he was dying. In November 1916, Marie Valerie received the summons she had dreaded her entire life. She rushed to Schönbrunn Palace. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of medicine and impending doom. The emperor, the man who had been the sun around which her entire life orbited, was fading. He was suffering from pneumonia, his lungs filling with fluid, his body finally surrendering to the exhaustion of 7 decades of duty. The scene of his death on November 21st, 1916, is one of the most poignant in Habsburg history. Even on his deathbed, Franz Joseph tried to work. He asked to be woken at 3:30 a.m. the next morning to resume his paperwork. He never woke up. Marie Valerie was there. She was the one who gently closed his eyes. She was the one who knelt beside the iron cot where the ruler of 50 million people lay dead. With his last breath, the 19th century effectively ended. For Valerie, the loss was total. Franz Joseph had been her protector, her ally, the one person who loved her without the neurotic conditions of her mother or the selfish betrayal of her husband. Without him, she was untethered. The funeral was the last great pageant of the monarchy. Valerie walked in the procession, a small black-clad figure amidst a sea of gray uniforms. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that they were bearing more than a man. They were bearing an empire. The new emperor, her young cousin Charles, was a good man, but he was inheriting a corpse. The next 2 years, 1917 and 1918, were a slow-motion nightmare. The war was lost. The people were starving. The different nationalities of the empire, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, were tearing away. the Hungarian Child watched as Hungary declared its total separation, severing the bond she was born to embody. Then came November 1918, the collapse. It happened quickly. The armistice was signed. Emperor Charles renounced participation in government. The Republic of German Austria was proclaimed. Overnight, the Habsburgs went from being demigods to being pariahs. The new Republican government passed the Habsburg Law. It was brutal. It stripped the family of their sovereign rights and banished them from the country unless they renounced their royal pretensions and accepted the status of private citizens. Marie Valerie faced a crisis. She was now simply Marie Valerie Habsburg-Lothringen. It was a Pyrrhic victory, secured only by a pragmatic humiliation similar to her renunciation 30 years prior. While many of her relatives, including the deposed Emperor Charles, fled into exile in Switzerland or Madeira, fearing reprisals or clinging to the delusion of a restoration, Marie Valerie made the choice that defined her character. She stayed. She signed the loyalty oaths required by the new republic, legally abolishing her own royal existence to secure her prize, Schloss Wallsee. The castle became an island in time. Outside its walls, the roaring twenties were beginning to rev their engines. It was the era of jazz, short skirts, hyperinflation, and the violent clashes of political radicals in the streets of Vienna. But inside Wallsee, Marie Valerie maintained the ghost of the 19th century. She tried to preserve the rhythms of the old life, the daily mass, the charitable visits to the poor, the formal dinners, even as the family fortune dwindled due to the catastrophic devaluation of the currency. She was no longer the wealthy patroness who could build hospitals with a wave of her hand. She was now a land-rich, cash-poor widow of a dead empire, counting pennies to maintain the leaking roof of her ancestral home. Her isolation in these final years was profound. The angel of Wallsee was surrounded by people, yet entirely alone. Her children were growing up, marrying, and facing the harsh realities of a world where their titles were liabilities rather than assets. Her husband, Archduke Franz Salvator, remained physically present but emotionally absent. The collapse of the monarchy had stripped him of his military prestige and his purpose. He drifted through the castle like a bored tiger, his resentment at his diminished status palpable. The rift caused by his affair with Stephanie Richter and the birth of his illegitimate son had never truly healed. It had simply calcified into a polite, icy distance. Valerie knew he was waiting for the freedom that only her absence could provide. Then the body began to fail. It is a grim irony that Marie Valerie, the only one of Cece's children who was considered robust and grounded, would be struck down by a slow, wasting disease. In the early 1920s, she began to suffer from profound fatigue and swelling lymph nodes. The diagnosis was lymphoma. For a woman whose mother had spent a lifetime obsessing over health, dieting, and hiking to outrun the specter of age, Valerie's reaction to her own mortality was shockingly serene. She did not rage against the dying of the light. She did not travel to spas in a desperate search for a cure. Instead, she accepted the cancer with the resignation of a martyr. In her diaries, which had served as her confessional for 40 years, the tone shifted from anxiety to acceptance. She viewed her illness as the final station of her cross. She wrote of her readiness to join her parents, to see the papa she had adored, and the mama who had loved her too much. The decline was painful. The cancer ate away at her strength, confining her to the bed in her room overlooking the Danube. Yet even as she withered, she maintained control. She organized her affairs with the precision of a bureaucrat, ensuring her children would inherit what remained of her estate. She dictated letters to her scattered relatives, urging them to keep the faith and remain united. A final attempt to glue together the shards of the broken dynasty. On September 6, 1924, the end arrived. It was not the violent, bloody end of her brother Rudolf at Mayerling. It was not the sudden, shocking assassination of her mother in Geneva. It was a quiet, domestic death, the kind of normal death she had always prayed for. Surrounded by her children and her husband, Archduchess Marie Valerie breathed her last. She was 56 years old. Her sister Gisela, who had traveled from Munich to be by her side, wrote a letter that captured the poignant atmosphere of the room. She noted that Valerie seemed joyful to go. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound relief. The golden cage had finally opened. The reluctant gift was returning to the giver. But the story of Marie Valerie did not end with the closing of her coffin. In a twist that seemed scripted by a cynical playwright, the aftermath of her death vindicated every fear she had harbored about her marriage. Marie Valerie was barely cold in her grave when Archduke Franz Salvator began to move on. He did not spend his remaining years in mourning or penance. Instead, in 1934, at the age of 67, he remarried. His bride was not a royal princess. She was Baroness Melanie von Riesenfels, a woman nearly 40 years his junior. The marriage was morganatic and caused a ripple of distaste among the surviving Habsburgs. It was the final insult to Valerie's memory. The man for whom she had renounced a throne, the man whose infidelities she had borne, in silence had replaced the angel of Wallsee with a young girl. Franz Salvator lived until 1939, long enough to see his illegitimate son, with Stephanie Richter, rise in the ranks of the Nazi Party, a grotesque distortion of the imperial legacy Valerie had tried to protect. While the world rushed to paint Empress Sisi in gold and Crown Prince Rudolf in blood, creating legends that would sell souvenirs for a century, Archduchess Marie Valerie quietly stepped into the only role history had left for her, the witness. In the shadow of the titanic tragedies that defined her parents, she appears at first glance to be a minor character, the quiet one looking away in the family portrait, the background noise to the opera of the Habsburg downfall. But this silence is a deception. Marie Valerie was not merely an extra on the imperial stage. She was the axis upon which the emotional reality of the dynasty turned. She was the only human being who stood in the center of the room when the empire was crumbling. She held the hand of the grieving emperor when his son killed himself. She held the secrets of the empress when she cried out for death. She absorbed the shocks of history so that her father could continue to sign the papers that kept the world turning for a few more years. Her existence was a study in the brutality of favored status. To be the only one was not a blessing, but a slow devouring. Cece consumed Valerie's childhood to feed a starving heart. The empire consumed her identity to bribe a restless nation. Her husband consumed her devotion to feed a fragile ego. Everyone took from Marie Valerie, and she gave and gave until there was nothing left but a tired woman in a castle by the river. Yet, from the ashes of this consumption, she forged a weapon, her diaries. In those thousands of pages of handwriting, Marie Valerie achieved the ultimate revenge on the oblivion that tried to erase her. She told the truth. Through her eyes, the marble statues crack. We see the emperor not as a demigod, but as a lonely old man. We see Cece not as a fairy queen, but as a terrified mother running from the ghosts in her own mind. Marie Valerie was the reluctant gift that the monarchy gave to itself in a final desperate bid for survival. The monarchy died, but the gift remained to tell the tale. Her life serves as a haunting reminder that history is not built on treaties or battles, but on the quiet agony of daughters who love their fathers and wives who forgive the unforgivable. She was the last flicker of the hearth fire in the house of Habsburg. And when she closed her eyes, the house was finally, truly dark.